The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm so happy to share this conversation with you about Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who is a heroine who I knew about in the context of what she did in Canada. She also did a lot of stuff in the United States. And my guest is Nneka D, who is the author of a new book, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th-Century Black Radical Feminist. So this book, it's the first compilation of the writings of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. So it compiles writings by and about her. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a 19th century Black radical feminist, an abolitionist, suffragist, and one of the first Black women newspaper editors in North America. She also, as of the time of this recording, Canada just released a stamp with her on it to commemorate her importance to Canada, to Canadian Black history. So it's the first time I've had an episode that coincides with the launch of a stamp of the person who we're talking about. So Nneka D, who is my guest today, she is an assistant professor of history, core faculty in Africana Studies, and affiliate faculty in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Washington and Lee University. She's also co-founder and president of the Black Women's Studies Associations. Her research examines Black feminism and Black intellectual thought with an emphasis on 19th century African American women thinkers, which is, as she explains in here, how she came across Mary Ann Shadd Cary, a person whose name you may or may not know, but after you hear this episode, you'll never forget her. Honestly, she's such an iconic figure, and I love the work that Nneka D is doing to help elevate her importance. She's commemorated, Mary Ann, in Canada quite a bit, and we talk about this in the interview. In the United States, she's a bit less known, so I'm really happy that this book exists, and I'm happy to help share this with you. So enjoy this interview with Nneka D. So I'm joined today by Nneka Dennie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we're talking about, actually, I should tell you, so I'm based in Canada. You're in the United States.
I am.
On this podcast, I have done very few Canadian or United States people. I tend to talk about people from other countries. So I'm happy to be talking about somebody from North America, but we'll sort of explain how she's kind of a hero to both countries, to Canada and the US. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and we're just going to kind of talk through her life. So you know the story so well, I assume.
Sure. She's someone who I think is really fascinating because she did a lot of boundary breaking. She actually has a quote, one of my favorite ones from her, where she says something to the effect of, in anything relating to the condition of my people, I am insensible of boundaries. And I think that this description of herself as being insensible of boundaries is one that really captures the way that she traversed gender boundaries, racial boundaries, geographic boundaries in some really fascinating ways. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary was born in the U.S. in 1823. She was born free. She was not enslaved. Her family had descended from African Americans as well as from a German immigrant. So she was born free, and her family had some measure of wealth to the extent that African Americans during the 19th century could be considered wealthy.
So how did it come to be that her family was born free in America? Or that she was born free? Like, how did that happen in 1820 in America for a Black person?
Yes. So I'll start by saying that not all African Americans were enslaved at this point in time, even though it was relatively early in the 19th century. Not all African Americans were enslaved. There were free Black communities that existed primarily in the North, states like Pennsylvania, for instance, New York, Massachusetts. There were free African American communities who had long existed in those areas. In some cases, enslaved African Americans would have freed themselves, whether through purchasing their freedom or that of their family members. In other instances, perhaps they were fugitives from slavery. So there are a lot of different ways that African American communities came to be free. And sometimes they were never enslaved at all and perhaps had immigrated at some point from other parts of the world. And so one side of her family descended from a German immigrant as well. The other side of her family, I don't want to misspeak, but the other side of her family was African American. I don't recall at which point in time they gained their freedom. So I'm not going to accidentally lie to you about that. That's something I'll have to double check. But nevertheless, there were a number of African Americans who were free at this point in time, primarily concentrated in the northern part of the country, because throughout the South, there were various laws that banned free Black people from even setting foot in the state. So we see a bit of a geographic divide with where free Black communities were concentrated.
So she's born into this free Black family in Delaware? Is that where she was?
Yes. So she's born in Delaware in 1823. And then her family moves one or two states over, depending on the geography, I suppose, to Pennsylvania. As a child, Mary Ann Shadd Cary attended a Quaker school. She would later go on to become a teacher, and she starts teaching when she's around, let's say, 16, 17 years old. And she's teaching in public schools in that Delaware, Pennsylvania region. Mary Ann Shadd Cary's father was also an activist. And perhaps those forms of activism influenced her because she would soon take up the charge as well to begin advocating for African Americans. So she starts writing publicly. Her first surviving piece is published in 1849 in Frederick Douglass's newspaper. But prior to that, she actually did write as well a pamphlet called Hints to the Colored People of the North. And an exact copy has not survived the test of time, but we do have excerpts that were republished elsewhere. We see, even at this point in time, when she's, let's say, around 25 years old, if my math is correct, she's already articulating what she thinks needs to be done to improve the condition of African Americans. She's emphasizing really heavily self-reliance, and she's emphasizing that Black people need to take steps on their own behalf in order to advocate for freedom.
Can you just put into context how unusual that is for young Black women in this era to be like writing these pieces and publish it, like writing to Frederick Douglass and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Shadd Cary was one of the pioneers of Black women writing and speaking in public. The first American woman public lecturer who also wrote was Maria Stewart, who was writing in Boston in 1831 and 1832. So the point in time when Shadd Cary is entering the public sphere in this regard is almost 20 years later, not fully 20, but almost 20 years later, where there has already been a precedent, but it was not a time period when it was widely accepted for Black women in particular to be entering these discursive spaces. So, for example, Maria Stewart was ultimately run out of Boston because she was seen as being this sort of salacious figure. She was criticized for speaking in front of quote unquote promiscuous audiences, meaning co-ed audiences with both men and women, right? So within Shadd Cary's lifetime, there had already been backlash to Black women entering the public sphere in these ways. Black women were nevertheless active in literary societies, for instance, in abolitionist associations. But the ways that it was appropriate for women to be involved in the public sphere looked somewhat different. So things like writing a standalone letter to the editor, that was okay at this point in time. But where Shadd Cary becomes more and more scandalous is when she starts her own newspaper, which she does after she goes to Canada. So she leaves for Canada in 1851. This is right on the heels of the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially made it so that any enslaved person who ran away could be returned to slavery. They did not simply gain their freedom upon entering a free state. This was also a law that would have endangered free African Americans as well, who could easily be captured and sold into slavery, considering that there were incentives for bounty hunters to return enslaved people. So even if, let's say, there is hypothetically an accident or a case of mistaken identity, that's something that still endangers free Black people. Or famously, there's the case of Solomon Northup, the man who the movie 12 Years a Slave is based on, who was a free African American who was captured and sold into slavery. That being said, Shadd Cary and many others end up leaving the United States. So she leaves in 1851, and in 1852, she publishes what is probably her most famous piece called A Plea for Emigration. And in this pamphlet, Shadd Cary essentially argues that African Americans should leave the United States because there's no racism in Canada. Side note, questionable, right? That's not entirely true. But nevertheless, that was the argument that she was making. There's no racism in Canada. It's a wonderful place where you can thrive, where you can experience your labor being compensated fairly, right? Where the land is ripe for farming and things of this nature. In this document, she goes into a lot of detail about things that I myself am not particularly interested in, having to do with like the environment, for instance. She talks about the quality of the soil. She talks about the temperature. But nevertheless, she's doing these things in order to make the case on a very practical level that this is somewhere where people can come to, right? What she also does in A Plea for Emigration is establish the sort of racialized implications for Black people of coming to Canada. She sees emigration as an abolitionist strategy because in her mind, having the protection and the backing of the British Crown would allow African Americans who go to Canada to better contest slavery. She also suggests that it would allow them to provide more aid to the abolitionist movement. As she advocates for emigration to Canada, she also suggests that integration is possible there, and that there is no, quote, spirit of caste. That's what she calls it. So she really sees Canada as this safe haven. So she publishes A Plea for Emigration in 1852. And the following year, she begins her newspaper, The Provincial Freeman. Both of these acts of the pamphlet, of publishing the pamphlet and of also publishing her newspaper, these don't necessarily go over well with the existing Black male leadership of what she calls Canada West at the time. Shadd Cary enters this environment where there are already attempts to establish missions and refugee homes, for instance, among leaders such as Henry Bibb, who also had a newspaper in Canada. So to a certain extent, she was stepping on people's toes. She did not come to Canada and kiss the ring, as it were, and try to operate within the existing structures. Rather, she came to Canada. She established her own school. I don't think I mentioned that. She was a jack of all trades. She did 5 million different things. And so the environment that she's entering into is one where Black women, or women more broadly, aren't supposed to be doing that kind of thing. Shadd Cary was the first Black woman newspaper editor in North America. And so we see that this is new ground that she's breaking. I have to add a caveat here that Henry Bibb, who I mentioned, he was married to a woman named Mary Bibb, and it is suspected that she was involved in some of the editing of his newspaper. So that this title of laying claim to the first, perhaps it is Mary Bibb's as well to a certain extent. But Shadd Cary was operating as the sole editor to a greater extent than Mary Bibb was operating as the sole editor, I would say.
Can we just talk about, sorry, and when the newspaper came out, she didn't put her name on it, right?
And that's right. So she was pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes. Shadd Cary did not publish her name on the masthead of the newspaper at first, in part because she was aware of the sort of backlash that a woman would receive in having the audacity to publish her own newspaper. So it only contained the names of other men. When there were meetings that she wanted to organize to address various issues, for instance, Jane Rhodes has established that Mary Ann Shadd Cary would get some men to do it for her. So she was really collaborating with a lot of other people in order to publish the newspaper. But she does eventually come out as the editor of the newspaper. There's a piece, a letter to the editor that starts something to the effect of, "Dear Mr. Editor." And she responds to this letter, but she also says, "Hey, by the way, I'm not a Mr. I'm actually a woman." So Shadd Cary did take some steps to conceal her identity in the early days, as you mentioned, by not publishing her name on the masthead of the newspaper. She would also sign various editorials with her initials rather than her full name, or sometimes she would sign them with an asterisk rather than any name or initials at all. So there were some measures to conceal her identity and presumably protect herself as well. But at the same time, it was more or less a bit of an open secret that she's the person who was behind the newspaper.
Well, and because she would also like to try and drive up subscriptions. Is this part of where she would go around and give like public talks and things like that?
So she would give public lectures from the 50s really until I would say the 70s at least. And so the work that she's doing very much sought to draw on multiple strategies. She wasn't only writing pamphlets, she was also writing editorials. She was writing in other people's newspapers. She was delivering lectures. For example, there was a point in time, I want to say 1857, where she participated in a public debate with another man about the topic of immigration. The accounts of this debate established, one, that she won, but two, at the outset of this debate, the person who she was speaking with, J.C. Wares, established, although you are a woman, I'm not going to treat you any differently in this debate. We're here to talk about ideas, so let's talk about ideas, right? So there's a certain way in which Mary Ann Shadd Cary's gender was recognized by her contemporaries, but what they did with it looked different sometimes, right? So the person who she was debating said, "I'm not going to pull any punches just because you're a woman, right? You're here debating, so let's debate." But on the other hand, her gender was something that people could easily take shots at too. So for instance, one of the most famous criticisms that she received was published in Henry Bibb's newspaper, where he wrote that Shadd Cary, quote, has said and writes many things that we think shall add nothing to her credit as a lady. And so she's being accused of being unladylike for the types of work that she's doing on behalf of Black communities.
Can we talk a bit about the school that she established? Just well, and in the context of the school and then also the newspaper and in terms of finances and how she's able to get the struggles that she had to keep these things afloat.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was doing research for this book, looking at how she sought to fund the school was that I think that that's where some of the sadder parts of her story come through, because she was in this prolonged conflict, let's say, with Henry Bibb for a number of reasons, not simply because of the newspaper, not simply because of the school, but also because he had established the Refugee Home Society, which Mary Ann Shadd Cary essentially accused of misappropriating the funds that they were receiving that were supposed to be used to help people who were newly arrived from the United States. She writes in one of her pieces, for instance, that the clothes that were donated to the Refugee Home Society were being kept in a barn and being trampled on by horses and picked at by chickens. So she and Henry Bibb have this prolonged conflict, which also affects the type of funding that she's able to get or her struggle to get funding for the school. The American Missionary Association was a Christian organization that was philanthropic in nature. And that is where Shadd Cary got the money from to establish her school. She established this school as specifically an interracial one, although it appears that there were more Black students, of course, who were attending this school than white students. But she was adamant that the school should not replicate the quote unquote spirit of caste that existed in the United States. She was really in favor of integration. And looking at these letters, there are moments in time where Shadd Cary is expressing the personal challenges that she was encountering. So she notes, for instance, as she's giving an update on the school, that she's sorry she hasn't updated in a while because there was a cholera outbreak and she herself is recovering. And I think moments like that, it's just like, wow, here I am, like complaining about responding to 2 emails, and she is dealing with a cholera outbreak, right? So to a certain extent, I think it reminds contemporary readers that sometimes we need to buck up and get to it, right? With whatever it is that we're trying to do. But also, it's kind of sad because she also writes in one of these other pieces that someone else might have the strength to do it, but she doesn't, after withstanding all of these attacks on her character. So it wasn't easy for her to procure funding for the school. She also notes that she's having trouble even paying for her own basic necessities, right? So she's trying to get a salary, and is being accused at this point in time of pocketing too much money, for instance. And she's trying to establish that really the money that is being raised isn't enough to do what needs to be done to keep the lights on in the school, for lack of better words. Shadd Cary was trying to be strategic, but she constantly ran into financial difficulties, whether it had to do with funding her school or whether it had to do with funding her newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, which at various points in time was in and out of publication. It ran relatively consistently from 1853 to 1857, but Shadd Cary was not editor for this entire time. She stepped down as editor of the Provincial Freeman in 1855. And in so doing, she writes a farewell editorial titled Adieu. And she establishes that in light of financial difficulties with the newspaper, as well as some of the gendered criticisms that she herself has faced, that she will be stepping down. And she notes in this piece, somewhat defiantly, that she believes that these attacks have been on the newspaper have been in part because of her gender. She writes, for instance, that it is fit that you should comport your ugliest to a woman. So she attaches her gender to the ways that she experienced being an editor. But she also says in this really fierce way that other women should go ahead and become editors too. So she has a sort of famous line as well where she says something to the effect of, "To colored women in America, we have a word. We have broken the editorial ice, whether willingly or not, for your class in America. So go to editing, as many of you as are willing and able," essentially. Shadd Cary was cognizant of the types of challenges she faced in raising money, the challenges she faced in editing the newspaper, and how those were influenced by who she was as a person.
And then in the midst of all of this, like you said, feeling stressed out about like, oh my gosh, this email, and she's doing everything, all of the things. She's also married and she's having children at the same time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there's a bit less that's known about her personal family relations. So her husband did pass away, I believe, while she was pregnant, which of course is something that any human being would experience difficulty with. She did try to separate her personal life from her public life to a certain extent. After she got married, she didn't publish under her married name for about 6 months. So I do think that that was perhaps because she saw the ways that people were attacking her gender, or rather attacking her because of her gender. And she perhaps wanted to separate her wifely duties or her wifely life from the sort of public life that was taking place. There's not a lot that's known about her husband and children, but what we do know is that her husband was active as well in helping to raise money where possible. There's one letter, for instance, where he is telling her what to sell in order to try to make ends meet. Their relationship was to a certain extent impacted by the kinds of work that she was doing, but there's not a whole lot that we know about her husband and her children.
I just wanted to bring that up, well, partially just so everybody understands how much was on this woman's plate, but also because, so in Canada, they've just released for Black History Month a stamp of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and there's this big event where they were revealing the stamp picture, and there was all of her like descendants were there. So like she has a legacy in that way. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knows, like, she had children, they had children, and there's these people who are just beaming, just like so thrilled to see this stamp that was just at this press conference earlier this week in Canada.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. I haven't seen the stamp yet, so I have to look it up.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Dennie? This is how you deal with me!
No! Do not harm my children! Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa. Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever
the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. I'm really excited to buy this stamp. This episode is coming out a bit later than we're recording it, but Monday, I have it on my calendar. I'm like, buy a book of stamps, which I love. And that's the whole like America/Canada of it. But actually that leads me into, so after her husband passed away, she goes back to the US and she's involved in the Civil War, like helping to, what was she doing with that?
Yeah. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary returns to the U.S. in 1863, which is at the height of the Civil War. The Civil War is taking place from 1860 to 1865. This is something that I think is really significant, especially when we contrast it with some of her earlier work advocating for emigration. In one of my favorite Shadd Cary articles, it's a piece titled Meetings at Philadelphia, published in 1857. She writes, "Leave that slavery-cursed republic." And so for the United States to be a quote-unquote slavery-cursed republic, and for her to be sufficiently motivated to return, I think is really significant. I think that highlights the possibility of change that she saw with the coming of the Civil War. And so after she returns to the United States, she begins recruiting Black soldiers to the Union Army. She does this after Martin Delany, another abolitionist thinker, reaches out to her because he himself is one of the first African-American men to rise to a certain leadership rank within the military. I'm no military specialist. I can't tell you what the rank was, but he was one of the first to do so. So at this point in time, she starts recruiting soldiers, and she's also in contact with Delany's superior officer. There's one really interesting letter to me that I think is a little bit, I see it playing out in my head kind of like a movie, because she gets this letter from him, Delany's superior officer, and he's saying, look, I have some work for you to do. I need you to come from, I believe she was in Indiana at the time. I need you to come from there to New Haven, Connecticut. Take this train. When you arrive, go to this hotel. Ask for me at this time. And so I in my head, it sounds like there's a sort of sense of urgency and like there's some sort of clandestine activity taking place with the kinds of instructions that she was being given. And while there is no explicit mention that I have found to date of Shadd Cary supporting Black armed resistance, I do take her participation in the recruitment effort as this sort of tacit endorsement of Black self-defense.
And again, like we're going to get at the end talking about just kind of like places where she's honored. And it's just really interesting to me. And I don't know of any other figures who are like this, that there's an equivalent amount of places where she was in Canada and places where she was in the United States that have like little plaques and whatnot. But then she also becomes involved with the suffrage movement as well. Like she... I don't know, throughout her whole life, she's never just going to be like, you know what, I'm just going to hang out at home and just like pick up a hobby. She's like, what's the new social movement and how can I get involved in it constantly?
Absolutely. She really was a jack of all trades. And so Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a member of the executive board of the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1872, she delivered a speech to the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. And in this speech, she advocates specifically for women's suffrage. It appears that she was speaking alongside other suffragists on this particular day. But when you look at the records from the U.S. Senate minutes, she's not listed there. We do, however, have the text of her speech. So this is how we see some of the silences in the archives that emerge as we're doing historical research too, that she's missing from the actual governmental records of what transpires. Nevertheless, in this speech, Mary Ann Shadd Cary establishes that although the 14th and 15th Amendments were, quote unquote, otherwise grand in conception, that their exclusion of Black women was significant. Now, the 14th and 15th Amendments established that African Americans are citizens of the United States, grants African American men due process under the law, and grants African American men as well the right to vote. However, Black women did not gain the right to vote with the passage of, or the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So Mary Ann Shadd Cary is establishing with this speech that Black women also need the right to vote. And the way that she does this is very different from some of her earlier work. So I mentioned my favorite piece where she calls the US a slavery-cursed republic, but she has a very different tone when she's speaking to the Senate. She has a far more gentle approach in this instance. She says that one of the crowning glories of the United States is that it offers citizenship to people of every nation and of every clime. And she talks in this sort of laudatory way about American constitutional values in a way that I think is a stark departure from her earlier criticisms of the US as a slavery-cursed republic. Mary Ann Shadd Cary would also later found a short-lived organization called the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association. The minutes of this and the statement of purpose of this organization specifically emphasize the need for Black women to vote. It also emphasizes Black women's labor. She speaks as well about Black women's labor in a piece that she co-authored for the 1869 Colored National Labor Convention. She wrote this piece alongside a few other women. And one of the things that they established in this piece, and this is in 1869, is that they support women who are agitating for the right to vote. And so this was really significant to Shadd Cary, this sort of connection between Black women's suffrage and Black women's labor, particularly from 1869 onwards.
And so let me know if this is correct or not. I've just been sort of like looking at the Wikipedia article just to remind me of sort of like the main things that happened in her life. But it says she became the first African-American woman to vote in a national election. Is that true?
I believe that some of the information we see confuses the first sometimes, simply because, well, here's what I'll say. If Jane Rhodes said it was true, then I believe that it was true. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a lot of firsts, and it's sometimes hard to keep track of which first she was. I think when it comes to her being the first Black woman to vote in a national election, there is documentation of her petitioning for her right to vote. And this was using a form that other women would have submitted as well, just a standard form where you're filling in the blanks with your name. And it was called a petition to remove political disabilities. That was the language that was being used at the time. And Shadd Cary did submit one of these, but I'm not certain of the outcome. So I don't know if I would say that she was the first Black woman to vote in one of these elections, but she certainly was consistently making an attempt to do so.
I was just double checking because overall, I was actually surprised by how much detail was in the Wikipedia article. You never know. And I just went through to where they had their reference from. And actually, the place that the reference from doesn't say that. So this is just someone being confused somewhere.
If Jane Rhodes said it, I would believe it. If anyone else says it, I'm not so sure. But Jane Rhodes is the person who wrote the biography of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And that's the book that introduced me to Shadd Cary. And that's sort of the Shadd Cary Bible in my view. So if it's in there, I believe it. If it's not so sure.
Someone's just being confused. But actually, this reminds me when I'm looking at this is she also went to law school.
Yes.
We forgot to talk about that. She's not busy enough.
Yes. She's always doing so many things throughout her lifetime. She was the first Black woman to enroll in law school in the United States. She enrolled at Howard University's law school. She was not, however, the first woman to graduate. It took her 12 to 13 years to complete the law program. We're not entirely certain of why. but it did take her a long time to finish it, where it took other people probably 2 to 3 years to complete it. I suspect that, as we've already established, she was busy. She had a lot of things that she was doing, raising children on her own at this point in time, more than likely. She also was teaching still. She was going on lecture tours throughout the rest of the country. So, she was busy. She had other things to do.
I respect it. Yeah, she's doing it. She's doing a part-time degree, and you know what? Great. Anyone who can do that is great. But yeah, so I just wanted to go through just some of the ways that she's been commemorated. Although I will say, so she died 1893 from stomach cancer. So she's around 70 years old at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But so just this list of, so her former residence in Washington, D.C. was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1976. And in 1987, she was designated a Women's History Month honoree by the National Women's History Project. In 1998, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. This is all in the U.S. In Canada, she is designated a Person of National Historic Significance with a plaque in Chatham, Ontario. Also at BME Freedom Park in Ontario, there's provincial plaques honoring her and her newspaper. In Toronto, there's a plaque of where she published the Provincial Freeman while living in the city. So just everywhere where she was, there's a plaque, seemingly. She's also mentioned in Canada's Citizen Test Study Guide. So I guess people learn about her when they're becoming citizens. 1985, Mary Shadd Public School was opened in Scarborough, Ontario. The school motto, "Free to be the best of me," and the school anthem, "We're on the right track, Mary Shadd," are tributes to her. In 2018, the New York Times published a belated obituary for her. There's so much stuff. I love how many things there are, honestly. There could always be more, but there's people I talk about in this podcast with nothing.
Yeah, and that's what I think what's really fascinating to me too is that it seems as though there is much broader recognition of her in Canada than there is in the United States, which is unique to me because she spent about 12 years in Canada, and in those 12 years amassed such great influence that she's still being commemorated to this day. The majority of her life was in fact spent in the United States, but the comparable level of recognition and commemoration, I think, isn't quite there. And so I really think that she's someone who we all have something to learn from, right? Because she's doing so much, she's breaking so many different barriers in ways that are applicable to lots of different demographics or constituencies. And so I hope that with last year being the 200-year anniversary of her birth, that some of the momentum and the energy we're seeing around commemorating her continues and really introduces her to a broader audience.
Well, it's funny, just when I first came across the fact that you'd done this book, and then I got your book and I read it, and I had come across her entirely as a Canadian icon, and I was like, oh, she was in the US too. It's like, yeah, kind of majorly, kind of crucially for a long time, because it was just all in the context of Canada that I had heard about her before.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. Can you tell me if you remember how you first learned about Shadd Cary?
Gosh, I think it was probably just at some point when I was looking up I wanted to learn about Black Canadian women and just kind of find out, partially for the podcast and partially for my own interest. And her name just always comes up, and it's always in the context of the newspaper, basically. It's like, this is her, and she was the person who created this newspaper. And so it had the back of my mind, like, I want to learn more about her. And then just, I was just looking again at this list of commemorations. So there was a statue of her was unveiled at the University of Windsor 2 years ago. So I feel like in Canada, every February, she is brought to prominence again. And I'm like, oh yeah, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. So she was a Google Doodle.
Yes, I did see that Google Doodle.
In 2020. So yeah, I think it was in that context. There's the TV show, The Amazing Race Canada. One of their stops was they went by a commemoration of her, and some of her descendants are out here doing the work. I think that's where I've heard about her. Because I think they were on The Amazing Race talking about her. Actually, there's an author who I've interviewed on this podcast, Craig Shreve, and he is a descendant of her as well. He didn't write about her, but he is. And I came across that. So I don't know. I just feel like part of it is in Canada, there's not that many figures to celebrate that people know about to celebrate in Black History Month. And she's kind of she's kind of it. So
fair. That makes sense. Yeah. When I first came across Shadd Cary, I was reading in grad school and her name kept coming up in connection to other people or other moments or movements and things like that. As someone who was always involved in these networks, but tangentially so to a certain extent. And so eventually I asked myself, okay, let's go figure out who this woman is. And I've just found her so fascinating ever since.
well, and let's talk about you talk about this. I think it's in the introduction to your book, but that you hadn't intended to write this book at this point in time.
Yes.
And it just kind of came together. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was reading about Shadd Cary in grad school, when I kept seeing her name, I tried to look for a type of book like what I've put together now, right? Many Black women, thinkers, writers, feminists from the 19th century, a lot of them have edited collections of their work where you can look at the collected works of Ida B. Wells or Frances Harper or other figures. And so I went to look for one of Shadd Cary, and I realized that it didn't exist. And I said, okay, like maybe I'll get to that eventually. But being in academia and being in the humanities, the expectation is typically that you turn your dissertation into a book before you go on other side quests. And the impulse for me to do that first wasn't really, it wasn't as strong because of the timing of Shadd Cary's 200-year anniversary. So it seemed like a more timely endeavor to work on the Shadd Cary edited collection so that it would be out in time for October 9th, 2023, which was her birthday. And while the book wasn't fully out by that point in time, it was available for pre-order. And I did hold a book launch on her birthday to talk about the book alongside other scholars, which I think was really fantastic for being able to celebrate her on this really important anniversary. But that being said, I don't think I was supposed to write this book yet because of these sort of academic expectations when you have a tenure track job and they expect you to do certain things in order to remain employed. But nevertheless, I thought that the other book could wait because this one seemed more important at that particular point in time. And I think that it was also just helpful for me personally as well to do a deep dive into Shadd Cary first, because it allowed me to think through how I'm conceptualizing Black radicalism during the 19th century and what that meant for Black women, which is something that I'm exploring in more detail in the other book that I'm working on.
And so you talk about that. I found so much interesting stuff, like obviously Mary Ann Shadd Cary's writings, but just you talking about the process of writing this book in the foreword and then in the afterword. Can you talk about how her papers are all over the place and the challenge of just trying to compile them?
Yes. Oh my goodness. And in one way, I lucked out working on this book because a lot of the material that I draw on has been digitized. And that is helpful because Mary Ann Shadd Cary's papers are all over the place. She was publishing in newspapers throughout the United States. She was writing her own editorials in the Provincial Freeman. And so her records are spread out through, off the top of my head, three main places, I would say. One, the Archives of Ontario, which has a whole lot of material. Two, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center in Washington, D.C. Three, the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans. And these are not places that you can get to by just hopping in your car and driving 20 minutes, right? These places you require a plane to get from one place to the next if you would like to do so in a timely manner. But luckily for me, many of the newspapers that Shadd Cary wrote in have been made available online or they've been digitized elsewhere. So this book as well, to a certain extent, was a pandemic project. I started working on it probably within 1 to 2 months of the COVID shutdowns. Because so much material was online, I actually felt like things were flowing really quickly in the early days of working on this book. I think I probably finished chapters 1 and 2 in maybe 1 to 2 months. It moved really quickly. And then chapters 3 and 4 took a very long time because I simply had other things to do. And things weren't as easily accessible at that point in time. But that being said, when it comes to the process of doing the research, having the archivist work with me to make things available online, begging and pleading with the Kislak Center at UPenn, that's who owns the scans of the Provincial Freeman. These things were all part of the research process. I also need to give a shout out to the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State because they helped to obtain some of these materials that are part of the book. And I was doing a fellowship there last year. So we were all working on making Shadd Cary's materials available to the public in some way, shape, or form, with the Center for Black Digital Research hosting Douglas Day, this annual transcribe-a-thon that uses the materials from some of these places I've just mentioned and is going to make them available, make those transcriptions available online. So it was a very long process to be able to compile these materials. But I am grateful that now the book is out in the world.
Well, and that's where you said that in the first place, you're like, oh, surely there's a book like this in existence that I can, oh, there's not. And it's like, oh, this is why there wasn't. Because like,
right, absolutely.
This is the amount of work it takes to make this book. And I mean, it's lucky in a way, I guess, that you're doing this in the era where things are digitization is possible. If someone 25 years ago was trying to do this, they would be hopping on those planes. And yeah.
Absolutely. And so I as a historian working in the 21st century, I certainly do feel like I have it easier than people who would have been doing this work 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
So I had messaged you about this part of my show. So I just keep an ongoing score of all the people who we talk about. And I sent you all the categories. I wanted you to be not thrown off when I suddenly did this. And I'm so interested to see where Mary Ann Shadd Cary is going to land. So the 4 categories that we have, and they were invented by me in the first place. It was basically just because I talk about all different kinds of people, and I want everybody to be able to score highly in some category, So it's measuring different. So even if there's somebody who, back in history, all they did was some sort of like scandalous affair, it's like, well, at least they're going to get points for scandal, even if they get points for other. But Mary Ann Shadd Cary, I'm curious. So the first category is that it's the scandaliciousness. And that is very much in the context of the time and place where she was living. Did people find what she was doing scandalous? And it's a score of 0 to 10. And what do you think?
Yeah, I am going to have to give her a 7 on the scandalousness scale. And that is because while she did face certain kinds of criticism, she also had people who were co-signing her and who were working alongside her.
Yeah. Well, and who was it you said, the person who was like run out of town for being like a Black woman with an opinion?
Yeah, Mariah Stewart.
I feel like if we were doing her, she would get a higher score because people just didn't. She didn't have that support. So the next category is scheminess, which I use the word scheminess just so all the categories can start with S, but really just means like cleverness and like coming up with a plan, executing the plan, seeing what was going on and being flexible and adaptable. And where do you think she would fall on that in a 0 to 10?
I've got to give her a 10 out of 10 for scheminess. As a schemer myself, I am particularly drawn to the ways that she stayed scheming in order to publish the newspaper. She had to scheme. In order to get funding, that requires a different kind of scheming, but scheming nonetheless. I think that scheminess was really central to the ways that she sought to advocate for Black people in general and Black women in particular.
I love that. I love that about her. And I think it really came across just in you recounting her story. It's like she had these goals and aims, and she's like, okay, how am I going to make this happen in like a world that is not going to support this necessarily? So yeah, I love it. She's always, stay scheming. Her significance, and you can interpret that however you want, her significance to everything. Like she was the first of so many things, right? She's all these plaques. So in terms of like her significance to world history, but if you think about her significance to the people around her, like the children who went to her school, like what did they go on and do? That's a kind of significance as well. So where would you put her there, 0 to 10?
Yeah. I feel like I would be doing her a disservice if I gave her anything less than a 10 for significance.
Mm-hmm.
She, just to give a quick recap, she was an editor, she was a writer, she was a lawyer, she was a teacher, she was a lecturer, she was an abolitionist, she was a suffragist. She did so many different things. And in many of those categories, she was the first in some way, shape, or form. And I think that we need to recognize how, despite her significance, she has been left out of the popular knowledge about African American history or Canadian history to a great degree. So I think we really should grapple more with her significance.
Absolutely. And I was just thinking about everything you just listed. Like, the work that she was doing was to support other people. And so not just like directly things like the school, but like by writing these editorials, how that puts an idea in somebody else's head. And then what do they think and what do they do? And advocating for abolition and for suffrage. Like, how many people does that affect? By changing
Right.
people's minds, by showing people that she's a role model. Yeah. I feel like it's like 10 plus, but 10 is as high as we go. And then the final category is the sexism bonus, which is basically how much more could she have done if they're not for sexism. So it's like giving her bonus points for having to put up with that.
Yeah, I'm going to give her an 8 for the sexism bonus. Mary Ann Shadd Cary accomplished a lot, and she was cognizant of the ways that her gender at some points in time worked against her. She also sought to subvert patriarchy by working alongside men to advance her goals. And in doing so, she also criticized Black women's exclusion from activism. This is something that she was explicit about, that she thought Black women should be able to have opinions in public without it being a problem. She always insisted on Black women's involvement in some way, shape, or form, whether it was in Black activism or, as we see later on, in women's suffrage. So I'm definitely going to have to give her an 8 for that one.
Well, and you mentioned too, like the people, Henry Bibb, was that his name?
Yes.
Who was just like, oh, you're not being ladylike. Where it's just like, are you kidding me? Like, on top of everything, it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing like 17 jobs and I have to be ladylike at the same time. Like,
right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So putting up with that. So that gives her a total of 35 out of 40, which in terms of all the people who've done this podcast, puts her very much towards the top. I'm just seeing like who else she's near, who you might have heard of. I do some pretty obscure people on the show. But it's definitely, she's very high up. Like, I don't know, like Catherine de Medici is 35.5. Mary Queen of Scots is 36. And Jinga of Angola is a 36. Like, she's in very good company, like scheming people.
Great. We love a schemer.
We love it. We love it. So can you tell everybody about just your book and the title and where they can get it and all that sort of stuff?
Yes, absolutely. My book is titled Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th-Century Black Radical Feminist. And this book really serves as an introduction to her by offering you a quick summary, as well as copies of letters, editorials, organizational records, and other documents by and about Shadd Cary. You can get it for 30% off with the discount code AAFLYG6. Once again, that is AAFLYG, then the number 6. And you can get that at the Oxford University Press website to use that discount code.
I'll put that in the show notes 100%. So if people are listening and they're like, oh, I didn't get it. Like, don't worry, I'll put it in the show. I'll put a link so everybody can get it. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about her. I think this is great. And actually, I'll just ask you one more question, because this is in February in Canada and the United States is Black History Month. So where do you see her significance in terms of Black history?
Yeah, I think that Shadd Cary highlights how Black networks functioned in both the US and Canada. And so within the context of Black history, it's nothing without the people who made it, right? And she's certainly one of those people through the ways that she was in contact with, for example, well-known figures like Frederick Douglass, right? She's certainly part of Black history for the ways that she was responding to and reflecting the key concerns of African Americans at these particular points in time.
I'm just looking at that list again because I'm just like, she's one of the only non-royal people to have a score as high as 35. She might be the highest ranking, like,
civilian.
Civilian. So I love that for her.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, sorry, I keep asking one more question. The cover image of your book. Speaking of Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a queen, like, people can look at the picture. I'm going to make that the picture, like the icon of this episode. But yeah, where did you talk about that picture?
Yes, I would love to. So that portrait is by an artist named Young Yemi, who actually painted it as a mural for the Toronto History Museums. And this was, I believe, in 2021 as part of a series that the museum was doing. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, that is my book cover. I just found my book cover. So I asked him if I could use the image. I explained what I'm doing with the book. And thankfully he agreed. And I am simply obsessed with the cover. He goes into detail, and I have a note about this in the book as well, about what different elements of the cover reflect. So, for example, some of the flowers that she's depicted wearing are the state flowers of Delaware, for instance. So different details, whether it has to do with the color choice or how something is designed, maps directly onto different parts of her life story.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love that too, because, and you say this in your book as well, but there's kind of only one, when you look her up, it's like, here's the one picture of her that we have.
Right. So that's an important point too. Thanks for the reminder. So there's only one surviving photograph of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. And that's naturally the image that everyone uses whenever they're publishing something about her, or whenever they're writing a news article about her. So I was glad to be able to have a different image of Shadd Cary. But also, and perhaps more importantly, I think that this image encourages us to have 21st century understandings of Shadd Cary, which is part of what I'm aiming to accomplish with my book. People often think of her as an editor, which she certainly was, but she was also so much more than that. And so I'm hoping that the image reflects this more expansive view of Shadd Cary that I hope to take with the book.
And at least for me, that was, at first I saw the cover, I'm like, oh, it's not the one picture of her. And then reading it, I'm like, oh, she's more than just the editor.
Right.
Yeah, there's so much more to her. So yeah, it's the perfect way to lure people in.
Good. All part of my grand scheme.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
So again, the book is called Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th-Century Black Radical Feminist by Nneka D. It is available all over the place, and I put the links in the show notes to get your discount code, and also on her publisher's page for this month, hopefully until the end of this month, you can for free read the introduction to the book, which kind of gives the extended biography of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, what we talked about, and a bit more as well. And I'm excited to share this information about Mary Ann Shadd Cary with you, especially because I know so many of the listeners are in the United States and in Canada, and we haven't talked a lot about people from those places. But now you have some sites that you can go visit, some plaques and some buildings that you can go make pilgrimages to if you're in those areas. So just a couple of reminders that I always say at the end of each episode. Actually, if you want to see where Mary Ann Shadd Cary fits on the Fredigan Memorial Scandalicious scale, score of 35 really puts her. Anything above 30 is kind of in the upper echelon. 35 and above is the top tier of scandalicious people on this podcast. And if you want to kind of see the whole scale, that is available at vulgarhistory.com. You can just click, there's a link there that you can just see the whole scale, just to kind of see where everybody fits into that, because we have an increasing amount of people on that scale. You can keep up with me and this podcast. I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, where you can message me. I always love to hear your thoughts and your ideas and your feedback about this podcast. Also, a great place where you can share your thoughts, ideas, and feedback is by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you're listening, because I see those. Those make me happy. And you can also support this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So if you pledge at least $1 or more a month, you get early ad-free access to all the episodes. But also, you can then get the ad-free access to the older episodes as well. It's not just the newer ones. And for $5 or more a month, you get all of that, plus also access to our bonus episodes, Vulgar Piece Theater, where we talk about costume dramas, and various other Patreon-only things that go on there. If you want to just listen to a specific bonus episodes, putting them slowly, there's like 4 available now, but there's more to come. Those are available. You can buy one of those episodes for $5 each. So it's a way that you can hear that without necessarily becoming a monthly Patreon member. Also, when you join the Patreon at $5 or more a month, I forget to say this sometimes, we have a Discord server, which is just like a big group chat. And we just talk shit, basically. It's a nice time. And merch is available at vulgarhistory.com/store. If you're outside the US, you can get better shipping if you go to our alternate store, vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. You can get in touch with me there's a form at vulgarhistory.com, or you can also email me directly at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Evelyn Malik for providing these transcripts. We'll be back next week as we continue this month-long celebration of Black History Month, and I'm really excited to keep doing this podcast and doing episodes with you. So anyway, until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.